No, I didn't have horses. As a teacher, I couldn't afford horses anymore. Um, but no, we had so few belongings that we put his car and my 16-foot sailboat into the moving van with all of our belongings and met it in California.
To another very interesting episode of Candid Conversations today. And our guest is a very special one who started her journey almost exactly like many of us. And then it took a detour, whether it was a sharp detour or a gradual one, we'll find out. We're talking to San Ramon's former mayor and city council member, Mary Lou Oliver. Welcome, Mary Lou.
Thank you very much for having me, Aparna.
How are you doing? How has this shelter in place been treating you?
I'm embarrassed to say I'm getting kind of accustomed to it and not having a schedule like I usually have, and being kind of able to plan out my day when I get up rather than a week ahead of time. So
you are enjoying it.
I kind of am, and I'm having trouble remembering what day of the week it is. Or the date. So you don't ask me any of those questions.
We won't. But what is the one thing you're going to miss when we are back to normal and we're all heading out the way we normally do?
Not having a schedule when I get up in the morning.
That's a good thing to miss, and that is one thing I think most of us have started ignoring. We don't know what day of the week or what we are dealing with day to day. It changes. So I am glad you shared that it is something you and many people are feeling at this time. One thing I would like to for you to talk about and maybe give every listener a little message on is the census, which is something we are all talking about now. What would be your message to people who still haven't responded?
My message to them was, it's to their own benefit, no matter what they think, to return the census information for everyone in their household. Because if they don't, San Ramon and the county and the state are going to lose valuable funds, which will in turn make programs more difficult. And it's just very important. I filled mine out the day I got the message.
Well, thank you. And we appreciate all early responders. It's going to be a difficult undertaking in fall when the census takers are trying to go door to door. We don't even know how that's going to look like. So please listen to Mary Lou and respond to your census questionnaires. So Mary Lou, over the years, you've done a lot and you still keep doing a lot. And I don't know how you do it, but I'm hoping we'll gain some insights. Tell us about your childhood, where you grew up, how life was like, and what are your fondest memories?
Well, I was a typical 40s and 50s child. I was born in Midland, Michigan, which is the home of Dow Chemical Company. So most of my friends growing up had parents that worked at the company or with supporting companies, supporting businesses. I had a wonderful childhood, very devoted parents, lots of activities. I was my father's only son, so I learned a lot of rather technical skills from him until I was 10 years old. And then my brother came along, and then he had a second son. So my brother and I are very close, but we both learned a lot of things that girls of that time did not know.
So can you give us examples of certain things?
Well, when I was 8 years old, my mother gave my dad a kit for an 8-foot sailboat to keep him busy over the winter. And so I learned carpentry skills. I spent every spare minute learning how to deal with wood, and that if you put soap on screws, wood screws, they go in really easily. If you don't, they're very hard. I learned how to use power tools and a lot of things. My father did a lot of things. He was a sailor. He sailed the Mackinac races in the 30s. He had a part ownership in an airplane, and he just loved to be going all the time, and really took me on a lot of adventures.
So when you say you can build, what is the biggest thing you can build with your carpenter skills?
Well, planter boxes.
Okay, I thought you could build a home probably.
No, but I can put in drywall if I have to, or that kind of thing. And home repairs. My husband is extremely good at that, so I'm usually the one handing him tools.
So it's an acquired skill from your dad. How about your mom? What was her background?
My mother she grew up in Akron, Ohio. She was a child of the Depression, but their family had florist shops, and somehow they got through quite well. And she went to Mary Grove College, and then she had a degree in accounting. She worked as the financial person for the flower shops. And then she met my father and found out that he was a private pilot. So she immediately took flying lessons, the only girl at Akron U taking flying lessons. She was always, I guess you would say, the corporate wife. My father would call at 4:30 and say, I'm bringing 8 people from Germany home for cocktails before dinner. And she would have everything ready in a half an hour.
Wow. And to manage the household, and I'm assuming many women did not work at that time outside the house.
Very few women of the mothers of my friends worked.
And she was one of them. So a role model for you. Before we talk about your dad, who was very accomplished in his own field, who was the naughtier of the 2 siblings, you or your brother?
Oh, me. Oh, really, me. My father was a very independent thinker, and so was his daughter. So we locked heads every now and then. They gave me a lot of freedom that most of the time I didn't abuse, but there was the occasion here or there that I got into some mischief and arguments over the dinner table that made my mother hide her head. But we got along pretty well.
But that's more sounds like a creative kind of conversation where you are putting forth your views and your dad had some other views. But I was talking about getting into trouble with doing things that you're not supposed to do as a kid. That too, I'm assuming you got into trouble more.
Well, I had an awful lot of freedom. So I had a car was able to drive and had access to a car when I was 14. So I had a horse out about 5 miles away, and I drove back and forth to ride my horse. I didn't start dating until I was 16, mostly because I was too busy with horses to be interested in boys.
So, so who taught you how to drive a car? There weren't driving schools back then, were there?
No, my dad.
Oh,
My dad.
was that fun?
It was, and an amazing number of my friends also learned to drive in that car. It was a 1948 Hudson. It was indestructible, and stick shift, of course. And then somehow its transmission made it until it was 10 years old.
Well, so let's talk about your dad now, William Goggin. He worked his way up the corporate ladder and ended up as the chairman of the board for Dow Corning Corporation. Can you give us a little background on how that happened and how his journey inspired you to also take on something?
Well, Dad was very much, I think he probably would have been in college forever if his father hadn't said, no, get out in the world and do something. He has master's degrees in both, or did have master's degrees in electrical engineering and chemical engineering. He worked for Dow from about, I think, 1935 on as the head of the plastics department. He didn't start out as the head of the plastics department. He started out in the chemistry department and then went into plastics, became very expert in plastics, and post World War II went to Germany. And evidently the Germans were very into plastic technology, and he brought a lot of that back. So he also did a lot with magnesium, and the company was doing a lot with magnesium. But I remember him bringing home plastic toys and telling me to play hard with them and see if they break, because he was really into toy safety. And a lot of plastic toys were being made that were dangerous and would break into small parts. So I broke some toys.
How was it seeing your dad, obviously a very accomplished person, how was it impacting you as you were getting ready to go into college? Were you feeling there was pressure to do well and make the family proud, essentially, at that point?
Yes, there was pressure, but I think I'd already trained him in high school that being a student was not really my strong suit.
How so? Could you elaborate on that?
I found a lot of things more important than studying, like sailing and skiing and swimming, and yes, he was quite disturbed by that.
So as you go into college, your dad already knew, your mom knew what your interests were, where you were gravitating. What was it like for you in college as you made that decision? What was your major, and how were your college years?
Well, I went to a Catholic girls' school, and that probably says a lot about how, as you well know, how disciplined it was. So there wasn't the opportunities to, well, I was pretty structured in college, and I did well. My majors were English, and I think I had a science minor and a graphic arts minor. So after I graduated, I decided, after working at a summer camp I went to the camp starting when I was 8, and then became a junior counselor, and then counselor and finally wound up during my college years running the camp's horseback riding program. So that got me working with children, and I decided what I really wanted was to be a teacher. So I went to University of Michigan and got a degree and a teaching certificate in elementary education, and then started teaching school right out of University of Michigan.
And how was that received in the family? Was that welcome news that you had found your calling and you were following that dream?
Well, that was very fine with my mother. My father, I'm sure, was always disappointed I wasn't an engineer.
Okay, so that conversation was still running parallel to your life.
So, I think you could say that.
Okay, so what happens after you finish college and you started working? What happens in your life at that point? Where is the first turn happening?
Well, I taught for several years and then met my husband. After we were married, he got his PhD. He was still in school when I married him, finished up his PhD, then went on, spent quite a bit of time interviewing for jobs. And then we waited for our first child, born in October. And then when he was 5 weeks old, we packed up and moved to California, where he started work at Physics International in San Leandro.
And that was the reason you moved to California, because of work. Okay.
Yes, it kind of dragged me out here with my heels smoking. I hadn't been away from Michigan for, forever. And this was a long way to go. I'd traveled, but not gone anyplace else to live.
Did you have any conditions? Did you even suggest taking the horses somewhere there west?
No, I didn't have horses. As a teacher, I couldn't afford horses anymore. But no, we had so few belongings that we put his car and my 16-foot sailboat into the moving van with all of our belongings and met it in California.
So San Leandro was your first stop.
That was his stop, yeah.
How was it for you? Did you immediately start comparing Michigan and California, and what was the first thing you noticed was good or what was missing?
I was just too interested in what was going on and taking care of a new baby. We stayed in a not very nice motel put up by the business when we first came, and I couldn't get out of there fast enough. So we looked around the area. We had friends living in Livermore. So we moved to a rental in Livermore while we looked around for areas. There was a new subdivision on Crow Canyon Road in the south of Danville that looked very interesting to us. So we made an offer on the house and purchased a brand new home. And that was a big move for us.
Two questions. The motel you talked about that was not so great, was that somewhat like Motel 6 or even worse?
It was an efficiency motel. It had a little kitchenette, and the swimming pool was empty, and the tennis courts didn't have nets, and it was one of those kinds of places.
And do those motels exist still, or were they?
I doubt it very much.
So you haven't seen it.
It was on Mission Boulevard.
Oh, okay. That place has changed quite a bit. Now you're talking about moving south of Danville. I'm assuming at that time it was not called San Ramon, so you just said south of Danville. Is this the Twin Creeks neighborhood you're talking about?
Yes.
And how did it seem to you?
Well, there were only about 4 streets with houses built on them. for the people who are familiar with San Ramon, it was Twin Creeks Drive, Canyon Creek Drive, and a little bit of Dos Rios. And that was the extent of the whole area. The models had been open for about a year. And we lived there for 7 years.
How was the neighborhood like? Can you describe to us what, for taking us back to that time, how did it feel for you looking out into the valley? How was it?
Oh, it was beautiful. Hills all around, and the neighborhood was wonderful. There were a lot of people with children the same age as mine, a little bit older, a little bit younger. We were a very close group. We had a babysitting co-op, so that our children had other children to play with from a very young age. It was very pleasant. And it was, I didn't miss Michigan after about the first year.
So you start settling in, and at some point you have your second child.
Mm-hmm.
How is life at this point? How are you involved in other things? Are you still just focusing on the family?
Pretty much family. My husband was working out of state fairly frequently for fairly long periods of time. So it was just me and the kids and the neighbors. So
pretty much like a regular family moving into the neighborhood, just focusing on family stuff.
Yes.
How were the schools at that time?
Non-existent.
Which one was there and how did it feel?
Well, there was a big question as to where the children were going to go to school. They were before they started school, they were talking about putting a school in Twin Creeks, but not much was getting done. And then all of a sudden there was a big influx of children coming into what would have been our son Stephen's kindergarten class. So they bought, I can't remember exactly how many, 8 or 9 individual portable classrooms from another school that was just getting rid of them. And they were not in very good condition. They were supposed to be there for 18 months to 2 years. Although then the bottom dropped out of financing for schools, and that they stayed there for about 6 years.
And at all this time, did the teacher in you ever come out and say, I want to do more as a teacher?
Oh, I was a mother helper, and mothers, at this point, a lot of parents, the women were starting to work. The prices were going up on the houses, and it took 2 incomes to make ends meet. And so there were times when there were only 3 or 4 mothers available to help in the classroom. So most years I did help in the classroom.
And you were satisfied with that role? You felt that was still fulfilling to you? Okay. Let's talk about the year 1970. It sort of is a turning point in your life. And if you can take us back to that year, that essentially got you involved in the conversation on planning in San Ramon and housing, and changed the course of your life over the next decade.
Well, I'll have to back up a little bit.
Okay.
The Bishop Ranch area was either owned or leased, purchased, I'm not sure which, by Western Electric Corporation. And they were going to build a model city here. And the model city plan called for housing and the business section, which would have been manufacturing and office. And so the Bishop Ranch was laid out as a commercial area in the county. and the area of the Twin Creeks was planned for housing. Carl Dame followed the Western Electric plan very, very closely. The single-family homes in Twin Creeks, the duets, the condominiums that are on Bollinger Canyon Road, and everything down to Norris Canyon Road were built according to the Western Electric plan. Western Electric had backed out by this time. From there on in, the planning was different, didn't follow the plan, and he had his own ideas, and some of the people who lived in Twin Creeks didn't care for some of his ideas. We were concerned that the densities were getting a little high, that there would be drainage issues, of which there were. So Pat Boom and I got involved in the planning issues. We had a homeowners association that had no property, but we were just a social organization. Pat Boom's husband actually published a newsletter called Over the Back Fence, which we all looked forward to. And everybody knew most everybody in the whole subdivision. So the homeowners association started with Pat and me especially, started going to planning commission meetings and making our opinions known. Meanwhile, at the same time, San Ramon was growing from the south toward the north, and things were happening pretty fast. And the South San Ramon had its own homeowners association, called the San Ramon Homeowners Association. Eventually, the two associations got together. We spoke with one voice when we agreed, which wasn't all the time. And things just followed from there.
So let's talk about the Planning Commission. It wasn't as we know it now, the San Ramon Planning Commission. This is a different one.
This was the Planning Commission originally was at the county, but there was so much happening in the South County, and Martinez seemed far away from the people who were interested. So they made a regional planning commission for for the whole valley, Alamo, San Ramon, and Danville. So that commission was made up of local people from this area. They pretty much had the final say on planning issues. So we made our voices known, and when we needed to, we could muster up people from the community to come and back us up.
And that would have come from the years of involvement in your community and in the schools.
Yes.
Let's talk about the Incorporation Committee. You were one of the founding members. How did it feel like to be a part of that group? What were some of the conversations like? Any memories that stand out?
Well, we were getting kind of in a pinch, literally. There were several moves to incorporate. There was a movement to incorporate all of the San Ramon Valley. That one failed. There was a movement to incorporate Dublin and the south end of San Ramon, but not the Twin Creeks area. That failed. And that would have been a very interesting district because it crossed a county line. Danville or Dublin was the first to incorporate, and then Danville incorporated. And when Danville was working on its incorporation, it was looking at its boundaries, and its boundaries left out the Twin Creeks area, but came down to Crow Canyon Road on the freeway. And one of their maps picked up a big piece of the Bishop Ranch and put it in Danville. And a group of us started thinking, well, that's the only real commercial that we have. There is no there in San Ramon. So San Ramon really needs to protect that property.
So there was a man named Dewey Mansfield who in 1982 had suggested annexing San Ramon to Danville. And I'm assuming all these conversations are a part of a conversation and suggestion that he also talked about, that not to have a San Ramon only election, but just how did it feel? Here you were working so hard, and here's the person saying, we don't really need it.
Well, we were in a defense mode, and probably if all things were equal, which they weren't, San Ramon was probably a little bit ahead of itself in becoming incorporated. One of the Board of Supervisors members was saying, or was heard saying, those people don't even have enough sense to tie their own shoes. So this tied shoelace became the symbol of the incorporators. We wore tied shoelaces on our shirts when we went to the Board of Supervisors meetings or Planning Commission meetings. But they paid for the incorporation feasibility study in Danville, but they wouldn't pay for San Ramon's. So the Incorporation Study Committee ponied up the money, hired a consultant, and the consultant wrote our feasibility study. And it came out that San Ramon would be feasible. We went forward. At the same time, the county was very low on funds. They had stopped street sweeping, and the parks, the only park was Athen Downs, and that belonged to Dublin San Ramon Services District, not San Ramon. Public works, streets weren't getting fixed. The city was literally not on their list of priorities, or the San Ramon area was not on their list of priorities. Police services were practically non-existent. When my children were little, they were told to call the fire department in case of emergency, because the fire department would at least come. If you called the police, you might get an officer within 4 hours. There was one deputy that was stationed in Alamo, covered all of the South County and all the way to Vasco Road. So
he would be severely overworked at this time. I cannot even imagine.
He was not only overworked. One time, the kids came running to me and said, "There's a bomb at the school." And I went over there to see what it was. I told them to run back and not tell anybody or let anybody near it. And sure enough, it was a pipe bomb underneath the slide at the school, and it had a cigarette on that had been lit and laid across the fuse. But fortunately, the cigarette went out before it got to the fuse.
So was this somebody who did not like the slide's design, or was it somebody who did not want to take a test that day?
I have no idea. None whatsoever. But it took almost 3 hours for an officer to come down and see what it was.
And that could be a huge liability in today's time, should that bomb have gone off and somebody got injured. So let's move to 1983. The incorporation happens. San Ramon becomes the 17th city in Contra Costa County. How was the feeling for you personally being a part of the first city council for the city of San Ramon?
Oh, that was exciting. I had a wonderful time. There were 18 of us that ran for the city council, but it was a very interesting campaign because we were not only campaigning for the seat on the council, but we were also campaigning for the incorporation. So we all wore both hats, except for two other people who didn't want to incorporate, and they ran on an anti-incorporation platform. So once the vote went down, it was the highest percentage of people voting for cityhood in the state of California at the time. I can't remember the exact percentage, but I believe it was like 68, something like that.
A very high number. So our first council in San Ramon was you, of course, working with Diane Schinnerer, Wayne Bennett, Rick Harmon, and Jerry Ajluni.
Mm-hmm.
Very nascent city. Everything was new. There was no internet, nothing to base off of, like your decisions, your whatever you were doing. How were you reaching certain agreements and deciding this is the way we want to go, this is the policy we want to put in place? What were you basing it off of?
We hired a city manager that was a temporary city manager, and that was what he did. He was, his fort was starting new cities, and he'd done it a lot. So he was able to step right in and knew what steps needed to be taken. Plus, we had a wonderful city attorney who had been the county attorney for Santa Clara County. He knew all of the ins and outs. So he served right off the bat as our city attorney advisor. We hired a city clerk to handle the paperwork and just followed the city manager's direction. Learned a lot. The learning curve was, as you might expect, extremely steep.
And the learning curve brings some mistakes and some disagreements. Do you recall any that stand out in your mind? A major disagreement over an issue?
Not very early on. Those came later. We all were pretty much focused on the goal of getting the city up and running, getting departments. After the first probably year and a half, we started searching for a permanent or a city manager that was not a temporary city manager. Interviewed a lot of people, hired a fellow named Jim Robinson that came from Rancho Cucamonga as the deputy city manager. And he was very helpful, kept us on track. Yes, we had our disagreements, mostly over issues. None of us were afraid to vote no on something.
So you essentially worked together to make it work, and you were fortunate enough to have a good city manager to lead the efforts in that. Being told that we don't trust a new council by certain entities, and if you could elaborate the names of those entities, and how would it feel to a new council that's trying to get into this whole process with so much enthusiasm, and then hearing, we don't want to work with you, we still want to stay with the county?
Well, yeah, you're talking about the Bishop Ranch.
Yes.
And in a way, I don't blame them. When you look around at what some of the, I felt ridiculous things that other city councils were doing, especially to their business community, I can see why an entity the size of the Bishop Ranch would be very concerned about which way is this going to head. Yes, maybe these people are okay, but they're going to be changed, and there'll be other people that'll be anti-business. So they really didn't want to be part of the city off the bat. And we were new.
Yes, and there was a part of a conversation that if you could share that about people from the council having an interaction with Masood from Sunset Development, how it came to be the office park was also a part of the plan with the residential element that they were known for. How did that
Well,
happen?
that was even before incorporation. The Sunset Development had purchased the property. It was, as you mentioned, Masood was a home builder. He built a very large portion of Livermore at that time. And so he wanted to go to the county and have the zoning changed from commercial to residential. Well, quite a few of us panicked. We went to the county and said, no, that this won't work. There will be no commercial areas for San Ramon if this is the case. And we had a very good advocate in Sunny McPeak, who was on the Board of Supervisors at that time. And she was a housing and jobs balance advocate. And she was very strong about that. And she was probably as instrumental as anyone as protecting that commercial area.